Chapter 26. My spouse and I moved several times and were eventually an hour away from church. I didn't completely want to leave our current church, but the allure of helping a struggling local one drew us in. We made the decision to switch together, since thankfully my spouse and I didn't believe in submissive wives and treated each other as equals. The church's new pastor was looking for on-fire people to help transform it. When we arrived, we found this church to also be large, but it was very different. It had a low-energy congregation, and many members were considered to have worldly lifestyles. My spouse and I were strict, fiery, and had come to help. In the same fashion, we sat in the middle, turned heads with shocked faces at our worship, and called out when we agreed with the pastor's preaching. Just like the second church, we started to get closer to the pastor and his family. Both church and non-church events with the pastor's family took more and more of our time. We strategized with the pastor on how to improve the congregation, and he directed us to befriend specific people to cement their membership. As we started to enter the ministries, we weren't as warmly received as in the past. Our methods were questioned, and there was some bias against us coming from an even larger church, and we never became ministers. Without being in the ministry, we had much less sway over the congregation. Things started to fizzle out, and it was clear that the congregation wasn't going to change. Neither would we. Although my spouse and I had very little money, when we first joined the church fresh out of college, we started to do well for ourselves. This put us at odds with many other church members who did not go to college. Since they didn't make lots of money, the pastor didn't make lots of money either, and jealousy began. The pastor seemed to grow weary of our high and uncompromising energy level. Then, just like the first couple of churches, he resorted to taking more control. As the pastor laid down more and more rules, we began spending nights and breaks at work to study and disprove what was being preached. We weren't just rebelling, we were fighting with the truth on our side. We never confirmed the preaching anymore and furiously wrote notes all service to debunk later. Very targeted preaching started against us, essentially saying that we should be giving more time and money. Our exact style of home, model of car, and ages were often called out directly in preaching as an example of what is not humble or godly. If we can afford a nice car, we should be giving enough so that the pastor can afford a nice car too. The UPCI was now preaching the pastor oracle doctrine through its biggest named influential preachers, and the ideology made its way to this church. The pastor declared that all direction from God needed to be run through him. Do you want to go on a weekend getaway? Ask the pastor first and he will tell you if God approves or not. If you're thinking of buying a home, the pastor will direct you. Just as before, we refused to go along with this. Most members blindly accepted the pastor as their oracle. Not only would the pastor direct the lives of the people who asked, those same people would speak in church service about how thankful they were that the pastor was directing them. I'm so glad to be in church today. I was going to go on vacation with my family, but the pastor let me know God would be more pleased if we stayed home and came to service. This started happening in all the UPCI churches my other relatives attended across the country. It went something like this. Be involved in service. Get close to the pastor. Pastor gets jealous. Pastor becomes oracle. Members are controlled or forcefully pushed out. In one church, a newlywed couple was given an all-expenses-paid honeymoon to Hawaii. The man spoke in testimony service, days after the wedding, saying he was so thankful the pastor helped him be more pleasing to God. The pastor said it was more important for the newlyweds to be in service on Sunday, so they forfeited the honeymoon. At this point, we were dying to leave, but felt that God wanted us to stay. We battled through every service. The church rewrote certain so-called classic church songs to better fit their agenda, but we sang the originals. Other songs seemed to violate basic scriptural beliefs, so we made up our own words. We simply couldn't be broken or compromised. Standing against church pressure was nothing new. If song service ended but we were still praying, we kept standing. If there was a call for an approving response, we only did if we agreed. Once at a youth event with 500 attendees, I sat in the front row while the preacher asked everyone to take a pledge to not date for 1 year. He said if you agree to give yourself to God exclusively, stand and take this pledge. As nearly the entire crowd stood behind me, I stayed seated, sat in plain view of everyone. Incidentally, I met my spouse within that year. I stood true to my allegiance to the truth, disregarding authority as necessary. The pressure techniques didn't work, and eventually the pastor gruffly encouraged us to pray about moving to another church. We prayed and finally felt we could leave. The relief was enormous, and then we moved to another city. Next, I ask the question, is the United Pentecostal Church really a cult?